What if I told you that in the next 20 minutes, we could talk about something that could literally better your whole semester of teaching? Would you be interested? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do today. By the end of this video, you'll be able to identify your goals for this whole semester and begin making a plan to meet those goals. I remember in my first year of teaching, I so badly wanted to do a good job, but I didn't really know how to define what a good job was. So what you end up doing as a new teacher is you either try to do a little bit of everything, or you just do what comes most naturally and most comfortably to you. And that's why I think it's so important that we define early on, right here in the summer, what our learning outcomes are. So we ask the question, what is a learning outcome? Basically, a learning outcome is something that students can't leave your class without. It's your must-knows, the content that your students must know and be able to remember and use, but also the must-dos, like the skills that you really want to focus on throughout the course of the semester. It's also a test in the proficiency in those knowledge and skills that you've taught them throughout the semester. Basically, our course outcomes are giving us a framework or some action steps for the whole semester. So that leads us to the question, why are course outcomes important? I think there's three main reasons. The first one is alignment. So we want to make sure that our course accomplishes what we want it to. Okay, that way that our assessments are in line with what we've been teaching our students and everything is kind of coherent throughout the course of the semester. The second reason we want to have course outcomes is sequencing. So a lot of times, especially when you're teaching online or you're teaching a new subject, you have a little bit of trouble like making one lesson connect to the next lesson, connect to the next lesson. And by thinking about our course outcomes at the beginning of the semester, we can make sure that we're sequencing properly, but also that we're building on the students' prior knowledge. And finally, the reason we have course outcomes is because it just helps us focus. Imagine that I told you that you were going to be in some sort of sporting competition and that you needed to practice and prepare and get yourself ready for the competition. But I didn't tell you which sport you would be competing in. Well, that would make things a lot more challenging, wouldn't it? You wouldn't know whether to practice your jump shot for basketball or your pitching for baseball or your tennis serve or whatever because you just didn't know what you should be working on. I think the same thing is true for teaching and for learning. Without a clear direction of our outcomes, we don't have a clear picture for what we need to be focusing on and spending our energy in class on. So I think these outcomes will really help you narrow down that focus. So if you've been in the teaching community for a while, what I've been talking about may sound a little bit like something called backwards design. And backwards design is this idea that you can meet your learning outcomes by specifically stating what they are and then reverse engineering your semester plan to meet those outcomes. And there's really three stages of backwards design. The first stage is just to identify your learning outcomes. And then the second stage is you identify the evidence that your students are meeting those outcomes. And then the third stage is you begin implementing or coming up with a plan or strategy that you can then apply throughout the whole semester. But in this video, we're just going to be talking about phase one. And so phase one, we're identifying our learning outcomes. And where I recommend starting for this is going to your textbook. If your school has provided you a textbook, you usually can just flip through the first few pages in the table of contents. And at least in my situation, as I'm teaching oral English, there's a whole lot of things, grammar points that they want my students to know. There's vocabulary, and there's a little bit of pronunciation that we're working on as well. So what I did is I took 20 minutes or so and I looked through that table of contents section of my textbook. And as I was looking, I began to write down which of these learning outcomes, whether they be grammar points or pronunciation or vocabulary or whatever, which of these are being repeated frequently throughout the book. And so what I recommend you doing, if you already have your textbook, is to identify somewhere in the range of 3 to 5 learning outcomes from your textbook that are repeated multiple times. Again, these are not the subpoints, these are the main points for the whole semester. The next thing I encourage you to do is to think about what type of class are you teaching. So for my example, I teach an oral English class. So I know that I want to have a little bit of listening skills. I want to have a little bit of like writing and things like that. But my main focus is going to be on getting the students to be able to talk and have a conversation with each other. So interpersonal oral English. But depending on your context, you need to think about what type of class are you teaching? Are there any big exams that the students will have either during your semester or after they leave your class that you're kind of responsible for preparing them for? And then maybe what are your institutional goals? So has the dean of your school or the director of your department or teachers that have been there before you, do they have any like goals or framework that we're kind of moving our students towards in these classes? Begin to think about those, and they'll really help you identify those core objectives. Once you've kind of looked at your textbook and you've also thought about your class from the big picture and how it fits in with all the classes the students will take while they're at your school that you're teaching at, the next thing I would do is to think about the standards for whatever type of class you're teaching. So again, I'm teaching oral English to students in China, so it's a foreign language for them, of course. And so I'm going to approach things like the ACTFL or the OPI standards. If you aren't familiar with those, the ACTFL stands for the American Center for Teaching of Foreign Languages. And I found that the standards here are just super helpful because they very clearly break down what is like a novice in this language, what is an intermediate level, and what is more of an advanced or superior level of speaking a foreign language. And then for each of those main categories, they've broken them down further to say like this is a beginning or a low intermediate, this is like a middle intermediate, and this is an upper intermediate. And so you get a very clear picture of how to move your students from whatever level they come in at to what it looks like as a higher level of proficiency or level of mastery. And you can begin to plan how to move them along that spectrum. You can identify what level of students you'll be teaching primarily in two ways. You can obviously look at the title of your class. So if you're teaching intermediate oral English, then you know what level your students are supposed to be at. But then you can also kind of test the student's actual level compared to the level that these ACTFL and OPI standards like suggest that they should be at, and make some minor adjustments depending on your actual class makeup. And what I like to do is once I identify what level of proficiency or application my students should have, I also set like this is where they are and here is a target for them by the end of the semester. This is where I want to move them towards. So I think by consulting your textbook, looking at your larger institutional goals, and then identifying some key standards from like national boards like the ACTFL and OPI, you'll be able to draft 3 to 5 learning outcomes. And again, this is skills that the students, things that they'll be able to do, but then it's also content, things that they need to be able to know. And what I recommend to you is if you have your textbook available, or this is something that you have a little bit of time to do right now, that you just take a minute and pause the video and try to sketch up those learning outcomes while we're watching this video. Once you begin to identify your learning outcomes, our next step is to talk about how to express those learning outcomes. And for this, we're going to turn to Bloom's taxonomy. So we use Bloom's to break down our learning outcomes into more achievable learning processes. It gives us specific like action verbs that we can do throughout the semester. And what's cool is the higher you go up on Bloom's, the more challenging the task becomes, which also means the task potentially takes longer. So the reason I ask you to only identify somewhere from 3 to 5 of those core outcomes is because I think that you can take those core outcomes and turn each one of them into units. So if you have 3 units or 4 units in a semester, you can target one core outcome for each unit. So let me give you an example of how we can take a learning outcome and apply Bloom's to it to vary the level of challenge or difficulty for it. So let's say I had a simple task like in my class where I was teaching my students different personality traits or character traits. And let's say I was teaching them, let's keep it real simple, something like happiness, okay? So there's different ways that I could get them to show me that they understand the character trait of happiness. I could give them a multiple choice quiz and write the definition of happy and then circle the correct trait or the corresponding trait. That would just be getting them to recall their information. Maybe a different way of going about it is I could get the students to write the definition of happy. And that way they're recalling what that trait is that I taught them, but now they're also communicating and writing what they think happiness is. Or perhaps a third way is I could get them to read a story about a girl, and one of the feelings that she has in this story is at one point she feels happy. And that way they have to recall what happiness is, they have to apply it by correctly identifying the girl's feelings in the story, and they also have to communicate by telling me this is how I know that this girl feels this emotion called happiness. So what Bloom's does is by changing our action verbs from identifying as in recalling to changing it to applying and then changing it to communicating, it helps us be more specific with our expectations for our students, but also more specific with the directions that we give them. And what I found is that the more specific I can be as a teacher, the better my students are going to understand what they need to do, and it's going to help them be more successful and me be a whole lot less frustrated. So let me give you kind of a basic formula for writing course objectives. And I think that if you use this formula, your course objectives will not only be super clear and super concise, but they'll be super actionable, and they'll be things that you can actually work on throughout the course of the semester. And so the formula that I use for writing course objectives is we begin with the Bloom's action verb, and then we add the knowledge or skill that you got from your textbook or whatever, and then we end with the ACTFL or OPI level of proficiency. If you're not teaching oral English or English as a second language, you use your own level of proficiency and mastery. But let me say that again. It's Bloom's action verbs plus the knowledge or skill, and then finally the ACTFL level of proficiency. And what's cool is you can write these on your own on a sheet of paper, but there's also a really cool resource that Arizona State University put together where they let you select a Bloom's action verb and then write in that knowledge or skill that the students need to know, and it produces a course outcome for you. So I'll link that down in the description if you want to check out that resource. And so now I just want to show you an example of an outcome from my class that's written at 3 different proficiency levels. And what you'll notice is as the levels get more difficult, the action verbs change. So the Bloom's action verbs change. And then with those action verbs changing, it becomes an increased complexity in the knowledge and skills as well, and the proficiency also goes up. So for each level of difficulty, the verbs are changing, the knowledge and skills are changing slightly in their complexity, and then the proficiency is beginning to change as well. Hopefully by this point in the video, I've given you enough to get started with identifying your course outcomes and also writing them in a formulaic way that's really helpful for you and for your students. But what I want to do to conclude this video is just kind of give you a final checklist for writing learning outcomes. So this is when you really want to word them well and word them in a way that's going to work for you and work for your students. Here's what I recommend. First, they need to be clear and concise. One thing you might want to look for in this is that you're only using one action verb. Okay, so if you're trying to go all over Bloom's for every course outcome, you may be trying to get your students to do too much. And so either narrow it down or split it into 2 different course outcomes. The second thing you should look for is to make sure that your course outcomes are student friendly. So ask yourselves, would my students be able to read this and understand what I mean? And one way that you can test that to see if they do is, especially if you're in class, give your students a copy of your course outcomes and have them write your outcomes in their own words. And what you can do by that is get really good feedback to see, okay, they definitely understand it, this aligns with what I was wanting them to do, or this is way off, I need to explain this more or change this up a little bit for them to understand it. Along the lines of your outcomes being student friendly, they should also be student centered. So your course outcomes, isn't your goals as a teacher, to inspire your students and to do all these type of things, or just the things that you want to teach them. This should be like things that they're going to be doing, things that they need to know, things that they need to be able to do. And so what I recommend is the fourth step, which is make sure that your course outcomes are concrete actions, that they're not overly abstract and theoretical or based on principles, but they're practical, and ultimately that they're measurable. And the reason for that is because in the next video, we're going to be talking about how to assess those learning outcomes and provide good evidence that you're actually meeting them. And if they're all theoretical, it's going to be really hard to assess them. And so that's all for this video. What I encourage you to do is to take some time before you click off and go ahead and write down some of your learning outcomes. Identify them in your textbook. Use the different resources that I talked to you about. And then once you write them down for yourself, maybe discuss them with your team or your coworkers and see if these outcomes really do align with what you want to be teaching over the course of this semester. And then what I encourage you to do is once you've written them down, you identified them, you feel good about them, head on over to our next video where we're talking about identifying the evidence of actually meeting those learning outcomes. Can't wait to see you in the next video. Bye, guys.